Hello and welcome to the channel. Today happens to be a red letter day. So after much waiting and more than one order, we finally got all our parts together. So I think it's about time for us to get into reassembly on this thing. But before we can do that, we need to install our new bearings and check our bearing clearance. Now when it comes to main bearings, it's not just as simple as going to the Honda dealership and saying I want new main bearings. There's actually 4 different insert thicknesses. So you actually have to find the code. The code for the main bearing selection is determined on should be on the side of the engine. This here, where it says AAABBB. That's half of the code. And then the other half of the code is actually on the end of the crankshaft. This 111111, if that's visible on the camera. And those two numbers together help you determine, well, number and letter, help you determine what bearing thickness you need or was originally designed for your engine. So for this particular engine, we determined that we need pink, 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 yellow, yellow, yellow. And if you're lucky, you'll be able to, if you look very closely, you can see a really faded yellow marking. That's another helpful way to determine what bearing thickness you're looking at there. And it's a similar process for the crank pin bearings. Except for the crank pins, it's actually written on the side of the con rod. And not sure if my engine was unique in this, but the number had worn right off. I think it was written on with like marker or something at the Honda factory. But it had completely worn off, so I had to measure those to determine replacements for the crank pins. But for the mains, we know what we've got, so we'll just insert our new bearings, and then we'll take a clearance using plastic gauge. And we'll do the same for the lower crankcase half. Now when you're installing bearings, they're pretty foolproof. The only thing to watch for is that little tab. There's only one way that they can go in, so just make sure that tab lines up there. And just kind of press it down. And make sure obviously that the top edge is flush. And as before, we're using the green plastic gauge. You don't want it to be right exactly, I guess that'd be at 6 o'clock position because there's an oil passage there. So you need to position this at about 7:30. And we just carefully position the lower crankcase half. Oh, you know what? I forgot the alignment pins. So you need to make sure to reinstall the alignment pins. So the alignment pins go here, here, and here. They don't go here. That one's actually weird. It's kind of a rounded bottom hole. It's not supposed to go there. But anyway, you just gently position this. Now for our bolts, I'll show you a little bit of a trick here. If you've got a lot of bolts and you're not really sure where they go, take a look at the part. So here we have 2 long bolts, we have 6 medium bolts, and then we have 4 small bolts. And using our powers of intuition, we can see that these passageways here have the most distance between the lower crankcase half and the top crankcase half. We happen to have 2 longer bolts. We would reason that the 2 long bolts go there. The next longest distance are these 6 holes here. So we would use the medium bolts there. You know, there's not a lot of mystery to it. The Honda plant will want to save money wherever they can, so they're not going to use long bolts. You know, they'll only use bolts of a sufficient length to do the job. They're not going to want to spend a ton of extra money on materials. And the short ones just go on these 4 outside positions. And again, we want to avoid the temptation to use any electronic or air tools to run these in, because it's definitely an instance where we need to control the amount of torque placed on these fasteners. And these take 27 foot-pounds. So, as before, just measure our clearance there. And yeah, we're looking just fine. So that's about 15 10,000ths, 15 10,000ths, 15 10,000ths, maybe call that 2,000ths, 15 10,000ths, and 15 10,000ths. So we're right on spec. Next thing we need to do is we need to clean up the crankshaft. It's still got some oil and dust on it from before anyway. Generally speaking, you want this operation to be as close to surgically clean as possible. So these crankcases are real clean, but I'll give them a final wipe in the bearing area, get any of this plastic gauge off, clean up the crankshaft, then meet you back here in just half a second to reinstall the alternator chain tensioner, well, alternator chain slide, and crankshaft and alternator shaft. Now, the tools we'll need for this job, basically the same as disassembly. The only difference is we are going to need some thread lockers and sealing compounds. So we've got our Permatex red there, got our Permatex blue. Unless stated otherwise, use the blue for everything. The red is really only for critical fasteners. We'll only use that in a few spots. Got our Honda Bond, which we're going to use for crankcase sealing. And not sure if we'll use this, but we do have some of the good old Permatex Ultra Black Maximum Oil Resistance Gasket Maker. That's good general purpose gasket maker right there. Now we can install the alternator chain slider. These do take Loctite. And when you apply Loctite, you want between 1/2 and 3/4 of a centimeter. So you don't want to coat the whole bolt in Loctite, because it doesn't really serve much purpose besides, potentially making a mess and making the person who does the job next a little bit miserable. Now we grease each one of the main bearings, just using moly grease or nearest equivalent. Now we can reinstall the chains, we can reinstall the crankshaft, including the chains this time. It's a good idea to give each one kind of a visual inspection if you haven't already. Just like so. Now for the alternator, we did actually go out and finally get our O-rings for our seals here. It's a good idea to give each of these a little bit of an oil. Not too much, just enough to help it slide in easily. Now there is little oil passages here, so you need to be careful to line up. This doesn't have any oil passages, so this just goes on top. But the starter clutch asks you to line up these holes. I'm not sure if you can see that on the camera. These holes with these holes on the shaft here. Just like that. But now this is going to have to come apart because we have to get it into the crankcase. But just something to be aware of when you do see me installing this in the crankcase. You want to make sure those oil passages line up. Now once we've got it lined up, we can reinsert our shim. And everything should go together like so. And we can just remove our little marking tape. Now once everything's installed, it's important to make sure that that starter gear is engaged with the drive gear. So as you rotate this, watch to make sure the gear behind is turning at the same time. Again, I'm not sure if that's well visible on the camera, it's kind of dark down there. And then we can install the alternator base bolts. Again, they require Loctite. And these each take 21 pound-feet of torque. Now we can reinstall our alternator chain tensioner. Again, we've got our wire there. And these bolts take Loctite as well. And each of these take 9 pound-feet of torque. Once that's reinstalled, don't forget to remove your wire. And you should see the ratchet mechanism return that chain to tension. Looks good. Now for the oil pass pipe plate thing. I don't know. Not sure if this thing actually has a real name. But you will notice there's 3 O-rings on the back. And there's one that should go here, but it was actually in my other crankcase half. So that's something to be aware of. If, for example, you didn't know there was an O-ring there and you reinstalled it, it might be out of position. Or conversely, if you're replacing the O-ring, but just assumed it got lost, you might end up with 2 O-rings in the passage, which probably wouldn't be the end of the world, but if you're trying to keep it clean, you want to make sure to know where all your O-rings are at. Then again, the small one. Comes on the little tip of this one. And again, these bolts take a small amount of Loctite. Don't want too much or else you'd risk it getting into the oil system. So just a small amount, even less so than usual. And you do want to wipe the grease off these bolts first, or else the Loctite isn't really going to do anything. That's got a bit of gunk in the threads. That should be plenty. Incidentally, if anyone from any of my American friends are watching this, these all take M6 by 1.0 bolts, which are not the same as those whatever passes for fasteners down in the States there. Actually, I understand most of you guys are metric anyway, especially for automotive fasteners. But you can't just necessarily use Home Depot taps on these or Home Depot bolts. I mean, it's made in Japan. You probably figure that out. Much better. Again, 9 foot-pounds. It's going to be pretty common among these M6 by 1.0 bolts. There we go. And then we can restake these tabs here. You kind of want to only hit the end of the tab. Try not to hit the base of it. If that makes sense. Now to do the con rods, these things actually take a lot of grease. And also note the alignment. So these casting marks here, these point towards the generator. And the words, if you're standing at the generator, these letters will be in the correct orientation. Anyway, we got our moly grease. And you give a good slathering to each bearing surface. As well as to the bolts, the studs. Truthfully, I'm not really sure why they recommend you do this, but it's in the manual. Again, making sure the orientation is correct, simply insert the con rod. And it even takes just a little bit of grease on the bearing, on the where the nut matches up. And again, these each take 26 pound-feet of torque. Now we give the transmission a quick little soak in some solvent. Just gonna release any dirt and grime that's on it. No need to get too fancy. While you're at it, you want to obviously give it a quick little visual inspection, make sure these dog gears are all in good shape. Now I'm going to avoid spraying the clutch basket directly with solvent. I mean, a little bit isn't going to matter too much, but and now we give them a little dip in some motorcycle oil. You want to use whatever you're using for your break-in oil for this. Wouldn't necessarily want to use the little oil can full of the old oil from the 70s. You just want to use standard oil for this. And you just want to make sure that there's a little bit of oil on the various teeth of these gears here. Don't need to get too crazy again. Now for installation, for transmission installation itself, there is one little piece, and I'm going to bring this to your attention, because this doesn't actually show up on the parts fiche or in the service manual. This little, I don't know, it sprays oil onto the bearing. And it goes in this position here. So if you heard a little tinkling when you separated your crankshaft or crankcase and you found this little piece rolling around on your bench, again, I'll try and get you a good look at it. So it's essentially got oil passages on the side and then a passage in the middle. And it looks like it would fit in various other positions, but this is where it actually goes. And you want that oil passage to point to the side. We'll just give the bearing surfaces a little prime. And you just want to make sure that everything's kind of engaging here. Now you need to make sure that this little indentation here on the bearing lines up with this protrusion down here, this protruding part. And the other one to make sure of is this little wire tab needs to fit right in the pocket there. And that's a little tricky. I actually, when I test fit this thing, which I do recommend, I test fit it to knock through the gears to make sure everything was working properly before gobbing it up, obviously. And that's a really important step. I won't bother filming it because this video is already probably getting pretty long. But yes, test fit is when you will find little things like that tab that needs to fit in there to make this fit together. This that needs to line up to that. And as well, it just gives you a little bit of peace of mind, a little bit of familiarity with the process. So again, you want to make sure that points down. And you can kind of feel it with your fingers when it seats into place properly. And it will, when you put the lower crankcase half on, there should be no gap between the bearing and the crankcase housing. Now one other thing that's going to save us trouble later is noting this thing here, the balancer. So this is an unevenly weighted shaft, spins freely, and connects to the crankshaft and basically balances out the vibration. Now there is a casing mark here, and there's a small mark which I won't be able to catch on camera because it's barely even visible. You kind of feel it with your finger, which I'll mark with tape. But essentially, if we make sure the engine's at top dead center and we install this with that mark aligned, it means we won't have to remove this later and rebalance the engine. Should make adjustment minimal, if any. So that's a good little time saver there. Again, it's not the end of the world. If you forget this, it's fine. You can just remove these bolts, remove the parts, and reassemble them in the correct orientation. But it's just one less thing for us to do later. The other thing we're going to do is, I've already done this because, as I say, I test fit the engine, or test fit the crankcase. But you want to make sure to grease up the shift forks. As we say, we're going to put the engine into top dead center, making sure the chains don't bind up. Now, before we gob this thing up, it's a good idea to do a little gut check. Just make sure, look over the manual if you haven't looked over the manual for a while. Make sure you've basically done everything right to this point, because once we get past this point, it's going to become a little bit more of a pain in the ass to fix it. So, give the mating surfaces one final clean. Just make sure any oil or grease that's gotten in there is out of the way. Now once again, we're going to be using the Honda Bond, and I don't have a lot of familiarity with this product. Not sure if I've ever used it before actually. Usually just use the black Permatex, but why not? We're going for an OEM build here. So they do recommend as thin of a film as possible. Although I can tell you in the real world, any tech's just going to put a glove on his hand, lick his finger and wipe the stuff on like that. We're going to use a brush for extra cute points today. Now you want to stay away from the bearings when you do this, as well as any other moving parts essentially. I think the stuff is glue. And just kind of brush it all over the entire mating surface. Having too much product will make a bit of a mess, but it's not critical. As long as it doesn't get into any of the moving parts or any of the sensitive assemblies. There. Now we do the same for the top crankcase half. And you don't want to take your time with this. You want to kind of move quickly. We've got about a minute before the surfaces can mate. But it will dry up if you take too much time here. So. I think I may have been a little bit too generous here. But again, that's not critical. Just an aesthetic thing. But I know whoever's taking this apart next is most likely going to be me. So, not as worried about it. Now, the first thing we need to line up are the shift forks. You want to make sure those mate completely. After that, we get our balancer, we line that back up, hold that in place, then we can just kind of press, oh shit. Alright, scratch that. Recall your alignment pins. Oh, well, that turned into a shit show real quick. These things happen. Okay, line up our balancer. Watch our shift forks. Make sure everything's lined up harmoniously. And try this again. Now let's take a minute to talk about what happened there. So I put the sealant on. It's probably on a little thick. These are the things you learn from experience. And being a little unfamiliar with the product, I'll just chalk it up to that. So I went to align it. Everything was looking good. Installed the part. Then of course remembered that I hadn't put the alignment pins back in. So at that point, pulled the thing off. Because it was partially set, it created a whole bunch of spider webs. Really, it was a huge mess. Now I stuck with it. I put the alignment pins in. I put the thing back on. Something had kicked out of alignment, one of these gears I think. Could have been one of these little bearings that are kind of pocketed in that protruding part there. And yeah, at that point I kind of more or less accepted that my goose was cooked. Pulled the thing off, cleaned it up, and I think we're going to call it a night. Call it right there. We'll approach it tomorrow with a fresh head. In the meantime, I think it's important, a lot of mechanics, I think, the ones with blogs at least, tend to come off looking a little perfect, and think that's a result of editing. We all make mistakes, whether it's a job you've done once or a job you've done a dozen times before. And all you can do is really own it and try to make it right. I probably could have salvaged the situation, but then I would have had a whole bunch of these, threads of permatex potentially getting in all the oil passages and all that stuff. And there's no point doing a job if you're going to do it badly, especially an engine job. But yeah, as I say, I'm going to come at it tomorrow. I'm going to come at it with a fresh head and hopefully a bit more patience. In the meantime, thanks for watching.